Paramita Ray. I teach art history. Occasionally I'm an interloper in your school. I also do wander into architectural history. And I'm very excited to collaborate with Professor Lawrence Chua, who all of you know, who is a member of your esteemed institution and a wonderful collaborator. We have collaborated to bring the incredible Swati Chattopadhyay here. Swati, you were supposed to come some years ago. That visit didn't work out, but we're so glad that we can welcome you all the way from Santa Barbara to Syracuse, which feels a bit like Santa Barbara today, frankly, right? We were hoping like for fall temperatures to impress her, but we've slid back into summer. I would like to start also by thanking our sponsors, specifically Dean Michael Speaks, who is always very generous whenever we historians approach him to bring speakers to campus. So thank you, Michael, and the School of Architecture for this amazing welcome. You guys are rock stars. You always pack the auditorium, so one feels the power of the energy of the school right here. Yes. Oh, I'm not. What? Oh, I'm being captioned, I've been told. That's creepy. I don't want to be captioned. All right. So here we go. Hopefully I'll get it right. Also want to thank the South Asia Center, the Syracuse University Humanities Center, and my department, the Department of Art and Music Histories. This lecture is part of the Syracuse University Humanities Center's symposium theme for 2024 through 25, which is community. Swati's lecture is titled, as you can see, The Architecture of Sovereignty, the Making and Unmaking of British India. And I think this is an appropriate title to pause at for a second as I read the land acknowledgement, which all of us know, but it's worth reminding us that we do acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral land Syracuse University resides. So who is Swati? Professor Chattopadhyay is an architect and architectural historian. She specializes in modern architecture and urbanism and the cultural landscape of the British Empire. She's a groundbreaking scholar using innovative methods. She's influenced the way Professor Chua thinks, how I think, and many, many others across the field think through ideas, both in architectural history as well as in art history. She has a very long string of awards, and I know she's going to kill me. She's told me to keep things very short, but I'm going to be long-winded about this, all right? She's won a Guggenheim Fellowship, 3 fellowships from the American Institute of Indian Studies, a J. Paul Getty Fellowship, a National Science Foundation grant, a fellowship from the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, a distinguished visiting fellowship from Queen Mary University of London, a Birkbeck Institute for the Humanities Fellowship at the University of London, and also the Society of Architectural Historians Founders Award. Some of you may know that in 2018 she was in fact awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Society of Architectural Historians. She's also a founding editor of Platform, which I hope all of you will check out. It's a very cutting-edge digital platform, a digital website with multiple voices across the field of art history contributing to it. She served as the director of the Subaltern Popular Workshop, a University of California multi-campus research group. And she has served quite fearlessly as the editor of the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians. For those of you who are below the age of 25, this is a very big deal, all right? She's the author of 3 groundbreaking books. Her most recent, Small Spaces, Recasting the Architecture of Empire, published by Bloomsbury, Unlearning the City, Infrastructure in a New Optical Field, and Representing Calcutta, Modernity, Nationalism, and the Colonial Uncanny. So Swati and I both come from Calcutta, so I'm a little biased, needless to say, over here. She's also co-edited 2 books, one with Jeremy White, Routledge Companion to Critical Approaches to Contemporary Architecture, and City Halls and Civic Materialism Towards a Global History of Urban Public Space. One of the remarkable things I think about Swati is She's very down to earth. She carries her fame very lightly. And she's a foodie. So great conversations about food. And she's actually teaching a course on architecture, space, and culinary traditions. That's a fancy way of saying food. She also writes with a very wry wit, with a lot of nuance and poetry, I think, in her language. So I hope you will see all of that come alive. Please join me in welcoming Swati Chattopadhyay.
Thank you, Romita. Well, I'm embarrassed now. I mean, that's you were not supposed to do that. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Romita and Lawrence, for arranging everything, and for the School of Architecture and all the departments, including Romita's, Art and Music Histories, and the Humanities Center for making this trip possible. I was supposed to make this trip 9 years ago. Things happened, life happens, it didn't happen, and so I'm very, very pleased to be here. So I'm going to talk about a part of my next book project. And some of the time I might get a little, I don't know, in the weeds, but you can always ask me questions later if there's something that's not clear. Because, you know, when we think about our topic, everything is clear in our head, right? But, so feel free to ask me any questions, and if there's something while I'm talking is not clear, you can raise your hand and say, I didn't get that, okay? Think of this as a classroom, it's just fine. So, I was interested in thinking about what does it mean to talk about sovereignty. And we have to think about what does sovereignty mean? Right to self-rule, self-determination, lots of different nuances over the, you know, from the 17th century onwards at least. But in linking with architecture, and I'm thinking of very much about buildings and spaces, I had to kind of give myself a series of questions. In other words, the questions, you can read the questions really are about what is it? Who does it concern? Who are the actors? Who are the makers? What is the process? What is the modality? What kind of communities does it describe? The Humanities Center's theme this year, I understand, is community. That actually says something very important in thinking about sovereignty. And much of my career, I've looked at the British Empire. And what I'm going to propose here is that the kind of sovereignty, the British state, first, the East India Company, a corporate colonial entity, and then the British government, the Raj. What they cobble together, it's an idiom of sovereignty. In other words, you really have to know something about the particularities to even understand what does it mean. And it did change from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. So what I want to do today is take some key sort of anchor points. And I've chosen, you know, an anchor point in the late 18th century and one in the mid 20th century. Those are the two sort of bookends. They also describe my book project, where I start and where I end. And then there are these points that I'm going to talk about. But this is very much a story about the practice and the limits of sovereignty. And this is one crowd, I don't have to explain this, is that no social processes happen in a spatial vacuum. So architecture space is fundamentally implied in everything, any social process. But I'm particularly interested in how landscapes, buildings, are not only constructed but destroyed. The politics of destruction. You know, I don't know what you were taught. When I went to architecture school in the Jurassic period, I was only taught how to build. never talk about unbuilding. We never talk about architecture as destruction. But when we have to talk about sovereignty, we have to talk about destruction. And so I have chosen examples where there is construction, there is building, but there is demolition. And different moments. And what does it mean? What does it say about the making of empire and the unmaking of empire? So what I'm going to show you are what I call landscape events. There's the larger landscape, there's the cultural landscape, not just the physical landscape. There are buildings, there are built objects. In other words, my examples sort of go kind of a spatial spectrum, from very small to very large. And I can give you a sense of how I came to it. So get this, I'm at the British Library. I really like my archives. I had asked for a manuscript. I got a little box. I'm going, doesn't look like a manuscript to me. I open it. And there was a little cross, Yebe. I looked at it and I recognized what it was because I read about it. I read about it in somebody's journal and letters to their mother. This person was Thomas More, a chaplain in the East India Company's army, in the military. First appointment. Guess what? Some people have some kind of luck. First appointment, he's a small baby. He gets posted to Kanpur, which was the center point of the Sepoy Rebellion, during the Sepoy Rebellion. So he had a lot to say about the rebellion and his role as chaplain in the East India Company. But that cross has a particular history, and you're looking at the cross, and the way it was devised that, it has a groove, so it sits in there. So it's supposed to be a kind of an object where you can put it on your, a side table, maybe bedside, I don't know. But it's a Yebek thing where you can put it together. It comes in two pieces. And it doesn't say in there, it basically, that's the text there. In memory of the women and children of His Majesty's 32nd Regiment, who were slaughtered near the spot 16 July 1857. What I know from his description is that the wood was harvested, and that's the term he used, harvested from the doors and windows of a house, a building called the Bibi Ghar, and they were splashed with blood. So I'm looking at this like, oh, this is a little too much. That's too much evidence. It's supposed to have had blood. That's at least the story. So here's it sitting, and the way I recognize it, because I recognize it's in writing. I'd looked at his journals, etc. British Library did not. So this is kind of fun of, sort of working in the archive. I figured out what this object was. They hadn't made the connection between this object and his journals, maps, and letters. Now, this guy and his wife, they produced actually several documents. One of them is what I call a mutiny scroll. It basically has a series of these images which have been actually pasted together. It's so large, when I open it in the British Library, it's an embarrassment because I can never roll it back properly. And I need serious help because I'm like, and they have very big tables, mind you. It's like, and they're doing it in the mid-1870s to 1890s. So I kind of date it as 1890. And it has this, and they're amateur paintings. I'm very interested in not simply how the authorities, administrative authorities in charge of policy making, how they crafted empire, what's their idea of sovereignty, in other words, policy of the state that they represent, but how ordinary people like you and me take on the mantle of sovereignty, how we understand, appropriate the tenets of sovereignty, how we live in those through the sovereign idioms, how we make them. So it's actually a fantastic example of this sort of, I would actually say, labor of love. They're patiently doing this. they could have hired better artists and just get it done. But they were laboring with it because they wanted to do it. They wanted to remember it. And just to, this location shows where the well was. So this image, as you can figure out, this is the well. This is the partially demolished BB Ghar. And near this was that 32nd Regiment little, memorial monument. The time period I'm looking at, there was a major war every decade, more than one. And I'm talking about major expeditions. What I'm going to refer to is the one marked in blue, which is the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. I'm going to refer to that. And this was not enough. Between 1783 and 1900, there were 117 insurgencies. Some are described as war, some as insurgencies. And I'm going to talk about what was described as an insurgency, which is the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857-59. Just to give you a sense of the idiom I'm talking about, is being crafted in this extremely violent century, or a century and a half. In other words, something is being made through the conflict, through the destruction, and through expansion. Just to locate you in here, the sites I'm going to talk about are Seringapatam, which is here, which is Mysore. And this is the city of Madras, now Chennai. And I will use Romita's point. This is Calcutta. That's the Bengal presidency. So this is called the Madras presidency. It's the Bengal presidency. And once the Brits get this is called the Bombay presidency. Okay. So between this is 1765, most of the subcontinent is not under British rule. By 1805, as you can see, all of this is under British rule because something has changed, because Mysore is now British territory. So they have a real major foothold. From Madras, they're expanding. And they're also expanding northwards. But just to give you a sense of, when the port cities like Madras, Calcutta were founded, they were very different creatures, spatially. And this is just a depiction from 1677. This is the first port city of the East India Company that would become the presidencies. Calcutta was founded 1690. Just note, I'm not going to go into it. This has a, kind of a, you look at this and what is that? How do you describe that even, right? But it is extreme, it's kind of huddled within enclosures within enclosures. I'm showing this because I will show you the emergence of an architectural idiom, which would be fundamentally different from that. So the Fourth Mysore War obviously gives you a sense. There were three before. This is the effort to fight one of the important princely kingdoms, which is of Mysore. And it came under Hyder Ali's grasp in the 1760s, and then Tipu Sultan, his son, came to the throne and became a real pain for the British because he befriended the French. So the context is the larger Anglo-French conflict around the world. So Tipu Sultan had to go. So Lord Wellesley, older brother of future Duke of Wellington, who was posted in Mysore as the resident, would be as the resident, he waged a war without the court of directors' permission. So he had to then justify why this war. But he did win the war. That meant that Tipu Sultan was dead and Mysore became British territory. What was interesting is that there's one thing to, there's nothing new about wars. When you win a war, you kind of occupy territory, you occupy the buildings, etc. But conquering armies make canny decisions about what to keep and what to destroy. Buildings are assets. So when you decide you're going to destroy something, you have to have some kind of argument behind it. So Tipu Sultan had 3 palaces. This is part of the fort. This is the island of Seringapatam, or Serinagapatna now. And there is a Darya Daulat Bagh Palace here, set in a garden. And this is the Lal Bagh Palace. So this is the site of this palace. There's absolutely nothing there. It's an archaeological site. There's no superstructure. There's all foundations, and this part, the audience hall used to be here. And it fascinated me when I went there that, wow, why destroy the building? And there are some descriptions of the building from the time of the conquest. Because the palace was looted, ransacked. And big, 2 things were very important. One was, of course, the treasure, which means I'm talking about actual gold and, valuables. The other was his library. That's another story, but his library was very important to prove that he was a true despot who needed to be brought down. So the looting had multiple sort of relations in terms of the conquering army. It's not new for conquering armies to loot systematically. That's what's happening here. But prize agents were given the responsibility of distributing the loot. Now, at that time, the building was existing, and they didn't immediately start dismantling the building. What they did was, apart from scattering the archive first went to Calcutta and then to London. That's the basis of the British Library in which I sit, looking at possibly blood-stained little crosses. What was destroyed, and we only have verbal descriptions and amateur drawings, was his famed throne, about 8 by 12 feet, or 10 feet, depending on which person you're listening to. It was destroyed piece by piece. It had gold, it was wrapped in gold. And there are various descriptions of, nickel thick or how thick the gold was and so on and so forth. Very particular descriptions. And this little, doesn't look like much, but that's about a bird. It was given to Her Majesty as the trophy. The rest was divided up, torn apart, and shared among I would imagine in this case, the higher rank officials. So this was in that building, in that courtyard, in the audience hall. There is an exact parallel in terms of how this object, kind of largish object, was taken apart and how that building was taken apart. And the building, it took some time. The building was taken apart on the pretext that you can't live there, that's bad, it's unhealthy, and so on and so forth. What do we know of the building? The only building that is existing, which is the Darya Daulat Bagh Palace, sits in the middle of a very large garden. The garden, of course, gardens are ephemeral landscapes, they've changed a lot, and was actually redesigned later. But the closest we can come through by looking at the existing palace, this was what it must have looked like. There are descriptions of the teak columns. So the columns, the beams, were actually extracted, harvested, and used for building, new buildings, and these were different kinds of buildings. One was the residency, and there were churches and other buildings that the East India Company was building after that. So you're looking at structures like this. They're extremely intricately crafted, They're like really crafted buildings and elaborate paintings. And both the palace within the fortification, which is the Lal Mahal Palace, and the Lal Bagh Palace were of the same kind of similar ilk. The Lal Mahal Palace was structurally different, was more masonry. I mean, going by the archaeological evidence, that's quite clear. So what remains of the Lal Bagh Palace, and a group of geographers, archaeologists are working on to figure out where the palace is. That's where the location. It's completely covered in, it's run over by greenery. But that's kind of, these, that's a dovecot. And this structure is also the one that's here in the Darya Daulat Palace. So you can actually figure out, okay, this is what the building looked like. So the question is, why? By every evidence we have, we can say they were actually quite beautiful buildings. Certainly palaces, there's a scale of that, there's a luxury of that. So two of the palaces were destroyed, demolished, and the Darya Daulat Bagh became the residence of the future Duke of Wellington. The Governor General and his brother were the two, Arthur and Richard were the two main figures in this war. So this made very clear in communication, moving within the circle of officials, and they're asking the court of directors who's sitting in London their permission. And after sort of much negotiation, much explanation, the court of directors said, and first the council in Calcutta said, yes, demolish the palace because it's not useful, and then you can use the materials for whatever advantageous purposes. And the surgeon came up with the rationale. They really need a rationale why you're demolishing this building. It said it's unfit for European habitation. It is insalubrious. In other words, the soldiers and everybody is falling sick. And you cannot actually modify it because you'll have to build walls in those verandas and change it. News to whom? That was routinely done. So the rationale is they're working very hard to impress on their bosses that these buildings need to come down. As scholars later have argued, the real reason was that Tipu had 8 sons. There was serious concern that they would come back and there will be a popular rebellion. The sons were exiled to Calcutta, suburbs of Calcutta, where they could be actually surveilled very easily. So close to the center of British power in the subcontinent. Now, what was built sort of in its place and why? So two things, sort of the historical context, which helps to know. One is that the system of subsidiary alliance, which was already in place but really kicked in under Wellesley. And this 1804 memo explains why native princes need to be made politically impotent. That why you need to really take the sovereignty from them to craft that empire. And Wellesley is the one who repeatedly uses the term empire to justify British occupation. And this is, mind you, what is British here? It's the East India Company. It's a corporate state. It's not a government. Yes, the parliament has some oversight over it. So the goal is that the native polities will literally be, and it is explicitly stated, the objective is for the British Empire sovereignty an empire to be created and sustained, local powers needed to be put under control. In other words, you have to take military control from them, you have to take political control from them. And what they did was they located a resident in these princely kingdoms, in the capital of the princely kingdoms. And the buildings that were built were called residencies. So the Mysore residency, which was built using the harvested, certainly the teak, looked like this. As you can, I'm not going to go into all stylistic discussion here. Sufficient to say, this is not what the Madras fort government house looked like. Nothing like it. It's not like neoclassical architecture is new to in 1803, 1804, but it is been given a certain meaning. The architectural form is like an empty vessel, you just pour meaning. So here, neoclassicism is being clearly articulated as the architecture of empire. And so the residencies often look like this. It's the front and back. And the bigger version, voila, Richard Wellesley, again without the court of directors' permission, started building a government house. And he said, India should be ruled from a palace and not a counting house. We usually take it that he's referring to the East India Company and their traders, ultimately, right? So it's really, it shouldn't be about trade, it should be about actually real sovereignty, real rule. But he's also referring to here, not with those of a retail dealer in muslins and indigo. Tipu Sultan was described as one of those who was kind of like a failed king because he was too interested in trade. He has these warehouses and so on and so forth. It's almost like they're describing themselves. And Government House replaced the existing buildings. There was a couple. And completely reconfigured that area. What it also did, and this is the obviously in Calcutta, this is the fort. So it's basically, it has two parts, whether you have the fort and you have the administrative district. But Government House, that's the building, basically created a large garden and took advantage of what was built as the open field, because this new fort had 100 cannons. Actually 99 was built, but the point is that it required, to fire the cannons, you needed open field. So this area was cleared to build all of this area. All the villages were moved to clear that area to build, to make the fort a functioning fort. So what it took, what the architects of Government House, the government engineer, Charles Wyatt, and then the landscapers after that, this is of course a map from a later time, used that open space as part of the elaborate grandeur that Wellesley wanted. I want to kind of pause a bit and think about what is sovereignty. I started with buildings and wars and so on and so forth. So the classic definition of sovereignty, and I'm referring to Thomas Hobbes here, 1651, is that there is sovereignties of two kinds. One is by institution, the other is by conquest. By institution, it means people come together to determine a sovereign and submit to, they're all his authority. Other is by right of conquest. They agree to submit themselves to the sovereign, otherwise they'll die. And the comparison was that, apparently parents can kill their children. So the parents' life, the children's lives completely depends on the parents. So sovereign is like a parent. Has the basic right of life and death. But Hobbes put in something important in there. And he wrote about passions, why passions are important. Part of the job of the Commonwealth, the sovereign Commonwealth, is to control the passions. of all these people, everybody wanting to be a sovereign by themselves. But he said, these two kinds of sovereignty are actually ultimately the same. Because you cannot have two kinds of rules for these two. Once a people submit through conquest, they have to be ruled the same way. He had North America in mind you. In any case, the point is that sovereignty can only, in terms of exercise of power, can only take one form. What he's saying, my interpretation, is that there's nothing separate called colonial sovereignty. Those of us who work on the British Empire routinely talk about colonial sovereignty. Hobbes would say, no, there's only one sovereignty. He also did say that it's not like the sovereign has unmitigated power. What the populace retains is that passion and their right to take up the sword if the sovereign doesn't deliver, my language. In other words, if we think of colonial sovereignty, when you're treating people, let's say, sovereignty in England is very different from sovereignty in colonial sovereignty, the kind that the British propagated in India, cobbled together in India. They were actually procedurally, policy-wise, materially different. So if that is colonial sovereignty, then colonial sovereignty is a continuous state of war. It's either the same or it is a continuous state of war. In other words, it is not sovereignty. So I want us to think about this. Coming back to what does it mean to think about colonial sovereignty of the British Empire in India? One is that you're extinguishing the sovereignty of existing princes and kingdoms and so on and so forth. That's conquest. But the fact is that it's significantly different because Indians were subjects, not citizens. They were not really brought into the hegemonic fold. As Ranaji Guha beautifully put it, it's dominance without hegemony. So sovereignty always, authority always teetered like this close to complete violence. So that's the sort of the pulse of sovereignty in India. So my colleagues, like Shudipta Sen, Rachel Benton, Lauren Benton, they have tried to kind of describe what is this kind of sovereignty. They seem anomalous. They are like palimpsestic. There are lots of different things going on. So I'm kind of building on that, but they're palimpsestic. But for me, it's really cobbled together, but it changes. It changes from one moment to another. It was reshaped over the career of the First East India Company and the British Raj. What it did, and now that's the part that interests me, is how architecture was deployed to kind of make it work. So I'm going to talk about, for the rest of the talk about two, what I call crisis 1 and crisis 2. So I'm shifting to a different war. 1856, the northern state of Awadh gets conquered, and it's here, annexed. March 1857, the sepoys, or the soldiers of the East India Company, rebel. Then they're joined by the peasantry, princes, townsmen. It becomes a popular rebellion. So the mutiny becomes a popular rebellion. And it spreads all across, from east to northern India, to northwestern India. So after dealing with the rebellion, in 1858, the parliament directly takes over the control of India. It is vested in the crown. In this process, because it was a violent process, the rebellion and its quelling the rebellion, the three main cities, Delhi, Lucknow, and Kanpur, were completely sacked, burnt. In other words, it's not just, again, that, war, conquest means there's going to be destruction. Villages, buildings were intentionally burnt, and not simply because, you don't want to give enemy any succor, you don't want to give them any kind of asset. It was done vengefully. It was done to show power. But one of the things that happened during the rebellion is that what I referred to earlier, about 200 women and children were killed in this place called Bibighar, and their bodies were thrown into the well. And initially, they covered it with dirt and put up a fence. And close to that, that's the little memorial that the 32nd put up. Now, Thomas More, and this is both again going back to Thomas More's sketches, he sent his mother a little plan of the Bibighar where the killing happened because the Bibighar was demolished. It was considered too potent a symbol for both parties. And images like this, and this is taken from prints, from drawings, and were widely popular across media. So this is the Moore's interpretation of it. What is important here is that what transpired in thinking about what you do with that site. The Governor General turned Viceroy. Once power moved, he became the Viceroy. He really was troubled by this. Like, how do you deal with this? So his wife, Lady Canning, Charlotte Canning, and her sister actually designed a memorial. But they were thinking about how this got to be done, and there were actually architects in England were tapped. Ultimately, officer of the East India Company, Henry Yule, actually did the design. But what was the function of the monument? It was not the only well in which bodies were thrown. There's actually a well, short distance, which is called the entrenchment, where the easy disposal of bodies, like burial, was putting them in a well. Not the only well. So why this? Looking at the evidence, what I describe it as fear and failure. The fact that the forces arrived in Kanpur on the site 12 hours too late, and they actually didn't know why this happened. So General Neil, who was in charge, decided he's going to burn villages, and then he made sepoys. He didn't know whether they linked with this killing at all. Licked the blood off the floor before they were hanged. So this one, this is the partially demolished Bibighar, and here is the gallows. So Moore is what you see putting in what I would call the three kind of motifs in there. So you can make the connection between the well, not yet built, the partially demolished Bibighar, and the gallows. So General Neil, even after he was reprimanded for what he was doing, just generally going around and killing people, he said, it is necessary in all eastern lands to establish a fear and awe of the government. Then and not till then are its benefits appreciated. So they call this racial sovereignty. One thing was very clear to Neil and to other administrators, despite what Lord Canning wanted. Lord Canning was like, you can't do this because this will not help quell the rebellion. You're going to make things worse. So he's speaking like an administrator, Well, he is the boss. But his generals were not quite listening to him. So this was a real crisis. It's a crisis at many levels. One was the failure to defend Kanpur and protect the women and children. So it is a crisis of masculinity. And it was made very clear it was black and white, Indians and British. There's no middle ground here. Mind you, the East India Company's soldiers, majority of them were Indian. Historian Kay, writing a few decades later, had this to say. He said, it is the fear of degradation, the fact that, it was not just failure. It is the idea that we have to fear those who have taught to fear us. That's the worst. And he added, in case it was not clear, that it is the very obduracy and intolerance and our pride of race that won the day. And he actually describes those who hold our lives in the hollow of their hands. He's talking about Indians. You want to kill that. What does it mean? So crisis of Europeans were at any given point a small minority. So you're dependent on Indian labor, Indian soldiers. Nothing works without that. So what kind of sovereignty, what kind of sharing of power would you imagine? So Henry Yule, with his earlier sketches, he imagined, and this is very much Charlotte Canning's prompt, that there were these two figures. They're mourning the dead. And a quote from Jeremiah 31:15, at that time was fulfilled what has been said of the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, much weeping and lamentation. Rachel was weeping over her sons, and she refused to be consoled, for they are no more. So in other words, general lament for loss, for large loss of a population. That idiom, the architectural idiom, was changed, but that was not acceptable. You could not represent mourning. You could not represent loss. You needed another idiom. So what came to be designed was that an enclosure was formed. So this is the enclosure. You enter here, and it's raised. So this is the well over the wellhead. So base was built over the wellhead. You can see the section here. And an angel was placed in the center of the raised wellhead. So it's a marble angel sculpture and a sandstone screen. And there was a very large park built around it. Other gravestones were brought in from other sites and placed there. Again, I'm telling you, this is not the only sites where British men, women, children were killed. Everything is being focused here on this site. And that interests me. Why there? It was a conspicuous consumption of land. All of this space around was described as parkland. It became a park. And Indians were not allowed within the enclosure. And anybody coming into the park needed to pay a fee. In other words, you're limiting access. And the fact that nobody was allowed into the enclosure, that's you're doing it racially. So in the way the enclosure was designed was a very ornate gate. Entering, you read. These are the ones who came through Great Tribulation. And the other side, that it is being raised by the British government, 1863. So Christianity and the state, the colonial state, was brought in a perfect sort of alignment in this description of, in this architectural order. What is interesting is that not a single name of the women and children were included. One name was included, and that name was the presumed perpetrator, Nana Dhandupant. So the base actually says, you can read the inscription, it actually names Dandupant here. You have to ask what's going on here. And it's presumed, because he escaped. The way I think about this monument, it's called the Memorial Well Monument. It's like an Aegis. When we use the term Aegis, we're thinking Aegis of the state, under the sub-umbrella of the state. That's why we kind of use it. That's actually not what it means. Aegis in Greek mythology is a shield. It's a protective armor. It has two functions. One, it protects against the Gorgon. The other is it's a reflective shield. So the Gorgon's face, that you cannot look at the Gorgon directly because it'll, turn you into stone. So you see the reflection and you behead the Gorgon. So architecturally, it is kind of beautifully expressed by creating an interior space of the monument and creating an exterior. Because you're not allowing everybody to get inside. So only some people are allowed inside. So the monument, that enclosure, acts as kind of shield that exudes fury. Goes on for several years. Monument becomes an extremely important site of pilgrimage, kind of in a mutiny, tours, etc. Crisis phase 2, Indian independence, 1947. On the eve of Indian independence, the state on the northern part is under Chief Minister Sarojini Naidu. She, being the chief, and rather she didn't do it directly, but she did right, said, you need to open up the park and give us access to it. We'll take care of the monument. The Memorial Well Society, which was in charge, this is a group of British businessmen in Kanpur, they did not like it. But they did not have the power to say no, that you cannot give you access. Who owns the land? And then they said, okay, fine, but you really cannot enter the enclosure. They really were uncomfortable. You can enter the park, but not the enclosure. Now what happened was that on just the eve of independence, a crowd got in and defaced the monument. Sounds familiar? Defaced the monument. The UP government, Sarojini Naidu, wrote a personal, email, letter, and said, made ample apologies, and it was fixed. Then, the UK High Commission, they're already doing, this is after Second World War, mind you. So they're doing this global thing up in Europe, in Turkey, in all over Asia, the Graves and Monuments Commission. So one wing of that, and this is, UK High Commission is the party in charge. The Memorial Wells Association. Technically, it's the planning, wing of the municipality of Kanpur. They were a minor player. They come together, the actors, to decide what is going to happen. So the debate that all this, all of this conversation, and mind you, all the plans and the drawings that I showed you, they are from a blueprint and they were all collated together, and it was one beautifully convenient for me that they were all in one document. So a lot of things came up in this discussion. And they brought in the Bishop of Lucknow, who's in charge of the ecclesiastical community. And his position was, don't make it my problem. This is a political problem. And the British High Commission, the person who was representing was Colonel Bullock. He kept saying that the Christians are white, and he's like, no, 99% of my congregation is Indian. Okay, you really need to understand that. So he was really troubled that this is being made into a religious issue. But they wanted the church to take over. So this becomes, which community are we talking about? At the time when it was built, it was very clear that there's the Indian community and the British community. Are Indian Christians to be included? No, that's India. At the same time, you're making it a very Christian connection here. So with the design that came about, they opened up the enclosure. So it, as you can see from the plan here, is that now it is the kind of the screen works as a kind of a backdrop. They didn't move anything under the ground. They moved the angel and plopped it in here. And this is it is a memorial church within the cantonment. And this is quite amazing. It's happening in between 47 and 50. They're still thinking of the cantonment as a British space. It's not. But the memorial church was within the cantonment. So it moves from this location to this location. So these are the actors. And it was very interesting what they had to say. Like, what is the justification for the design? How is it going to be done? This is the summary of what was discussed. One is that, the Memorial Garden Society said the monument should be moved to a secluded spot. Secluded spot? What secluded public spot? And it was agreed that all of these sort of agents agreed that no sign should be left of the old monument. It should be razed. Destroy all significance. Extraordinary. What they're saying is that, and mind you, here the bishop, the Lucknow Diocesan Trust, and this is the bishop speaking, he's saying, really, this is a political problem. Let the UK High Commission handle this. Okay? But the UK High Commission is also practical. We don't control territory anymore. I have to negotiate with whoever is in power, whether it's in Uttar Pradesh, whether in the city. That's what I have to do. I don't have territorial power anymore. But he's the one who said, wipe out all traces. And everybody agreed. Wipe out all traces. Leave no significance. And it's interesting to think of the redesign of this monument in terms of the conversation. We need to lose of the identity. In other words, it should not be represented as a British monument, really. So what are we preserving? And is it a British monument? Is it an Indian monument? Is it a Christian monument? This is all being debated. And this is the wonderful thing, it's about, of course, about what they want to protect is British prestige. What is the materialization of British prestige? During colonial rule, the description of the lords of the humankind. It's the aura of sovereignty everybody carried because of being white. What happens when you don't have political sovereignty anymore? Do you still carry that aura? Is sovereignty portable? Well, how does it figure in architecture and building decisions? And then they said, it would be terrible if any secular building, and then you have to ask, this is not a secular building. So the monument is not a secular building? And certainly no Hindu or Muslim religious buildings built on it. That gives you pause, okay? So it is now being clearly described as a Christian monument. And they were clear, you need to give it religious cover. That's why you move it to the site of the memorial church. So the redesign, there are multiple issues in here. Well, the basic idea is that you just move the superstructure. You're not moving. Exhumation was not going to happen. The UK High Commission was clear about it, and the bishop was clear about it. But the bishop also had something interesting to say about this. So you can see there's no mound, there's no stepped well. It's like the monument was kind of the obverse of a stepped well design. So you enter through the gate they kept, and you walk the path and you get this frame behind, sort of like the background, and there's the angel, sitting on this low pedestal. And this is what the bishop had to say. Why move the angel? It's not sacred or anything. The only one who had any sense in this was the bishop. Because he says, what are you doing? Like, you are not actually taking care of what was presumably important. But he was wrong. He presumed people who were buried underneath were the actually important people. They were not. One thing was made amply clear, that those women and children were never the subject of this monument. It was the designers and the authorities wanted a shield to protect against the fear and failure of their fear and failure. This is about white masculinity. What happened in 1947 crisis too is that the split that about 80s, that could no longer be maintained because now Indians can go inside. That architectural split, that enclosure, the split that the enclosure codified, could no longer be kept in place. The idea that leave no trace of its former significance. Again, then why preserve anything? So now, and these are images I took a couple of years ago. It lies in this overgrown churchyard. And I had a very interesting conversation with Reverend Cutting, who gave me permission to actually enter. Because now there's a different problem there. There's a right-wing Hindu government who do threaten Christian establishments. So there's a different problem of sovereignty here. But if I have to summarize what is happening here in terms of sovereignty, what is the idiom of sovereignty? Is that, when you think of the Mysore War and the demolition, etc., in some ways it is kind of a pro forma. That's what conquerors do. But it introduces and rationalizes an architectural idiom of neoclassicism. But it is in some ways the fact that they were actually not saying why they're demolishing the building. That's dissimulation. You're really not saying what you want to do. So sovereignty, one form, is dissimulation. But ultimately, and this is where I go back to Hobbes and say, not just colonial sovereignty, all sovereignty are built around a void. There's a hollow. The wonderful thing about the memorial monument is that it actually had physically, formally, a void in the center. The bodies remain. And people walk around in the parkland there. Sometimes I wonder what Bishop Robinson would have said if he lived. Thank you.